Okay, today we finished chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark, this last story that we have here. It's the next to the last story, I should say. We have one more, so we're almost finished, and I'm going to put all that together for you next Sunday so we can get that total picture of chapter 1. But this story here today is one, again, that we just kind of read and say, oh, that's nice, I appreciate that story, good, and then we just move on. We don't really pay attention to the depth and the power of this particular story. The scripture tells us that Jesus got up early in the morning, still dark. Everybody else was all sleeping. The disciples over there in a pile just having a good sleep. He gets up and he walks out the front door and goes off to a solitary place, which kind of means a place nobody even knows about. Way out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. And he goes out there, and it says that he spent his time praying. He stood there, kneeled there, in that wooded, secluded place and prayed early in the morning before sunrise, probably. And then, of course, his disciples wake up and look around, and Jesus is not where he normally is sleeping, and they don't know what to think about that. They look around the house, Jesus, Jesus, where are you? And so they need to find him because there's a big crowd already gathering in the town to hear him preach that day, probably, or to hear him teach anyway. And so they got to find Jesus. So they run out into the areas around the house, probably divide up. You go this way, you go that way. But Simon and the guys with him, they finally stumble up on him out in this solitary area. And they run into him and they say, Jesus, you know, everybody's looking for you. It's Sunday morning, time for you to get down there in the village where you're supposed to be. And then Jesus says, well, I don't think I'll go back to that village. Let's go to one of the other villages nearby, so that I can preach there also, because this is why I have come. So why did Jesus go off in the middle of nowhere to pray? I mean, there's a lot of good places probably around that house he could have prayed. He could have gone out in the backyard, on down the road a little ways. Why go way out into the wilderness area, the forest, into a solitary area? Well, it becomes obvious that he wanted to get away from all those people. That's what he wanted to do. That's why he went off out there. To get away, to have some calmness, to have some peace of mind, to pray and be one with God again. Because all these people in the village were already talking about him being the new king of Israel. They were already talking about him being the Messiah. They were already talking about him being the one that they've been looking for hundreds of years. They were ready to turn him into a king, into a Lord of Lords. They were ready to turn him into the new David. Yes, they were. It was like a political rally, you might call it. And Jesus knew that wasn't the reason why he came. Didn't come for the glory. Didn't come for the vanity. Didn't come to be made into a Messiah, to a Lord, for people to worship. Came for a different purpose. And of course, we have to ask, what was that purpose? And it becomes very clear when the disciples find him that this purpose was not to be popular and not to be loved by everybody. They come in and say to him basically, Lord, everybody's looking for you. We got a crowd down there you won't believe, Jesus. We got a lot of people following us, and they're going to be giving some pretty good donations, and our movement's going to go on, and we're going to be able to, soon as we can, put together an army and overthrow these Romans. It's a great opportunity, Lord. Let's get together, get back down there, because this is where you're already known. This is where people know who you are. It's a great place for you to be. And Jesus says, nope, 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 nope. We're going to go to these new villages I've never even been to before. Nearby, we're going to go over there. So the disciples had to kind of fold up their tent and follow him, probably wondering to themselves, he's going to preach? What does he mean to preach? Preach? What is that? Never heard of that. And that's really true. We, in our time and place, we've heard of preaching. Some people call me a preacher. Other people know preachers. We are very familiar with what a preacher is in our time and place. But in Jesus' time and place, in the Gospels, that word very seldom even appears. And so we have to get ourselves back into that mentality of that time, in which we think about, wait a minute, what does it mean to preach? Nobody in that time really had ever heard of somebody saying, I came to preach. Oh, they called Jesus a teacher, no doubt about it. Teacher this, teacher that. But they didn't call him preacher. No, they didn't call, what is a preacher? Who ever heard of a preacher? What is that? Well, there is a word in the Greek language and in the Hebrew that is translated as preacher. And it was used very, very rarely. But the way in which it was used in these villages and in these towns, they always had someone who was known as a herald or a town crier. And if the king or the nobleman in charge of that town had a will that he wanted people to know, if he had a new idea or a new dictate or a new law that he wanted the people to know, then the town crier would go out and he would communicate the will of the king. That's what he did. And he would basically shout and yell out and say, the king says, and he would speak all these things about what the king wanted to be done. And he was hired for that position because he had a loud voice and people could hear him, you see. It was called preaching, and that's what they did, is they went around the town telling people what was the will of the nobleman or the will of the king, so people would know that, because nobody could read. The literacy rate was about 2%, so you couldn't put something up on a post and expect people to read it. So they had to hear it. But essentially what preaching was communicating. It was communicating in the best possible way the will of the superior officer or nobleman or king. And the key thought was, it was to communicate. So what Jesus was really saying to his disciples was, I have come for the purpose of communicating. That's what preaching means. It means to communicate. And that's why I'm here. And so I want to go to these other villages so that I can communicate there as well. But you know, Jesus was extremely wise, a genius actually, in many ways. And if he was faced with the issue of how can I communicate the will of God, who is of course the superior one, how can I do that? How can I best communicate the will of God? And of course, he never studied anything about communication as we do in our era and time. But even today, we know this truth, that people will remember about 20% of what you tell them. They might remember as much as 30% of what you write down for them to read. But they will remember 80 to 90% of what you show them. Speaking is not the way to communicate. Writing a book basically is not the way to communicate. It's showing others what you're trying to say. And when Jesus said, the purpose of my life is to preach, he didn't mean that he was going to stand behind a pulpit and read scriptures and tell you what it means. I know a lot of people call me a preacher. I've been called a preacher for 50 years, but I am not. I don't see myself as being a preacher. I am a teacher. That's what I am. I teach the scriptures. I interpret the scriptures. I do all of that. But preaching is a whole other thing. And we've gotten kind of confused about that in our Christian life today. We think that preaching is what someone does when they stand up and they make a message and they tell people the message that they have, and everybody says, oh, that was a great message. That's really usually some form of teaching as opposed to preaching. Preaching is communicating the will of God through the way you live. That's what preaching is. Preaching is who you are and how you live and relate to other people. You preach in your relationships to others. That's how you really preach. That's how you really communicate with others what is the will of God. Is how you relate to them. That's where the true preaching takes place. It's not with words. And of course, at this point, I had a great illustration about St. Francis Assisi, who said that we must relate to others in love all the time, and we have to preach to everybody, but sometimes we also have to use words, but very seldom. The idea is we preach by how we live and what we show others to be the will of God. That's how we preach, and that's how Jesus preached. Think with me for just a moment. Look at what we have in the New Testament. We have a lot of stories about Jesus interacting with people. That's what we have the most. We don't have a book of sermons from Jesus. You know, every preacher that's ever preached that we call a preacher, they always have these books. Here's my book, here's my book. Jesus didn't have a book. The only time we hear about him writing anything was when he wrote in the sand and the wind blew it away. Because Jesus believed that the best way to communicate the gospel to people is by what you do, how you act toward them, what you do with them in your relationships. That's what he believed. Think about all the examples, and I could go on for a long time, but some of them jumped out of my mind. You remember when he washed the feet of the disciples? Wow, what a sermon that was. Unbelievable sermon that was. If I, your master, have washed your feet, what should you do for one another? Eh? And I can guarantee you that every one of those disciples, they remembered that lesson. Every time they saw their feet, they remembered that lesson. Jesus could have preached 100 sermons about that. But what he showed them is the critical idea. He showed them that that's why we're here, is to relieve the burdens of other people's lives, to refresh them, to wash their feet, to help them get the dirt out of their life, get the misery out of their life, get the pain out of their life. That's why we're here, and that's what we should be doing. And so he preached a sermon on that by washing their feet. And I'm sure you must remember all the stories. But one of the stories is when he went to Matthew, the tax collector, one of the most hated men in the entire city of Jerusalem. He was a born Jew who had decided to side with the Roman authorities and who was making a big living off of beating up his neighbors and taking their money in the way of saying, this is the tax you owe. He was a bad man, and people hated him throughout the entire city of Jerusalem. His name was known as the most miserable, horrible person you'd want to ever hang out with. But Jesus goes to him and says, come, follow me. What a sermon. What a sermon. Here's this man that everybody hates. Here's this man that everybody has given up on. Also, he did that with Levi as well. And the point of the message was, if I'm going to communicate to you God's love, then I've got to show you how I love the very people you don't love. That's the most important sermon I can preach to you. Because when I love those people that you think ought to be condemned, when I love those people that you think ought to not even be here in our midst, when I love them, that's a message to you that that's who you should love as well. And that's how you should love everyone, everybody, every place. What a sermon he preached when he did that. And then what about that woman that was caught in the act of adultery? She was already to be stoned to death. All the great religious leaders of that community already had picked up their stones, and they were ready to just obliterate her with those stones. But she watched as Jesus went into their midst and said, let whoever is without sin cast the first stone. And then she saw each one of them drop their stones and walk away. What a sermon! You can't preach something like that. People look at that and say, wow, that is something to see. These great teachers of the law and priests and all those people dropping their rocks and walking away because this man showed this woman mercy. Oh, I could go on and on about the different examples. Healed thousands of people. His family was so worried about him, they came to take him away one time because he was not getting any sleep, he wasn't eating, he wasn't doing anything but just trying to help people overcome their spiritual illnesses. One by one by one by one, just keep on doing it and keep on doing it, and people saw him do it that way. It was not just the miracle of these people being healed of their spiritual problems. It was the fact that he just kept on going. He didn't quit. He just kept on and kept on. And people saw that. And they said, this man really is showing us what God is like. Because that's what God does. He just keeps on, keeps on, keeps on, keeps on. The point is simply this, that when Jesus went with his disciples to the villages to preach, as he said, he went there to show God's will by the way he interacted with others. And poor disciples, they always had problems figuring things out. But I hope they understood eventually as time went by. Oh, I see. This is what we're supposed to do as well. We're supposed to preach by the way we interact with other people. We don't have to go to seminary. We don't have to have a degree in being a preacher or something of that nature. All we have to do is interact with people in the way to show them, as I treat you, God so has treated me. That's all we got to do to be a preacher like Jesus. And every one of us is called to be that preacher like Jesus. You know, C.S. Lewis was a great Christian author that wrote wonderful books. One of the most exciting ones he wrote was Screw Tape Letters, in which he imagines a school for the devils, and they have to learn how to be a good devil. And the professors are all there to teach people how to follow Satan and to give Christians misery. And of course, in the lessons that they teach, one of them is they teach the little young devils, they say, look, we really have the Christians where we want them now. They used to worship 7 days a week, but now we convinced them to worship only 1 day a week. What a great thought he had. But one of the great thoughts he also had as he wrote that book, The Screw Tape Letters, he wrote this. He said, and we have convinced them that the only one who can preach is a singular person in their community. And therefore, none of the others will ever try to preach in any way. So, yeah, evil is constantly trying to confuse us and set us back. But the Scriptures teach us and tell us clearly that if we follow Jesus like the disciples followed Jesus, then we need to become the preachers like Christ. Not like preachers we have today who study and interpret the Scriptures and do things like what I do up here. No, it's what you do out there in the world and how you relate to other people and how you treat other people and what hope you give them and what peace you give them and what love you give them. That's the true preaching. That's true evangelism. That's the way in which we spread the Word of God, by how we act and treat and live with people. That's where we actually experience true preaching as Jesus understood it to be. I don't have a lot of time here, just a few brief moments, but I want to share with you a few examples I saw just this week. Well, not just this week, just this year, I should say, of preaching. I was walking down the path as I do in the mornings for exercise, and in front of me were these two Spanish women. And one of them obviously had some real problem. You could tell she was crying. She pulled out a handkerchief and she was touching her eyes and she was just going on and on with her hands, all in Spanish. I didn't understand any of what they were saying. And the other woman was walking with her and just listening and listening. And I was afraid I was going to kind of run over them because they weren't walking real fast. And then as I got a little closer, all of a sudden they stopped, and I had to stop, of course, from behind. And one of the women took her arm and put it around the other woman, and they just sat there and cried together as I walked on by. And I said to myself, there's a good sermon going on there, I'm sure. Someone is loving someone. Someone is comforting someone. Someone is giving somebody hope. And I saw that with my own eyes. I understood that. And another time I saw it was actually last Christmas. I remember this so vividly. You know, we support Creatua Espacio here. That's one of our ministries. And every year at Christmas, we help create these bags of grocery, these boxes full of groceries, dry goods, beans and rice and pasta and things that they can use, the poor people who come that have very little food to eat. And we make these little Christmas boxes. Last year we did about 360 of those, handed those out to the refugees who live here in this town. And I went up there. We had a miscommunication in our community. I was the only person that went because we got the wrong date and time. But anyway, I was there. And so I helped to hand out the baskets. I helped to hand out the boxes. And of course there was all these expressions of gratitude and gracias, gracias, gracias. And it was such a thrilling thing to be able to know that these people with their little children would have something for Christmas. And they would have a little more to eat than they had had before. But one woman, she come up to me, and when I tried to give her her box, she just grabbed around me. And she was a short person, about this short. And she just grabbed, and she just kept crying and crying and crying and saying things, a bunch of things in Spanish. I had no idea what she was saying. But I just held her, and she held me, and we just thanked God together. There was a sermon that I enjoyed preaching that day. So the point of the whole message today is very simple. Jesus said, this is why I came to preach. And that means I came to show people in my relationships and in all that I do, this light of God in me. I let my light shine into their darkness. That's preaching. And that's why we must, as our little song said, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. That's true preaching as Jesus would have us to preach.